Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. I hope that you are all having a wonderful week, a wonderful Wednesday. Today is July 22nd, and I have a very exciting episode for you guys today. The theme for today is foreign films. I just caught a more recent Netflix film, a Netflix foreign film, and I have watched a couple other foreign films recently that I thought would kind of fit today's theme, and so that's kind of what I want to delve into for today's episode. So the first film that I'll be talking about is The Platform, a Netflix original film streaming right now from earlier this year. The second one is Best Picture Award winner Parasite out of South Korea. I'm sure most of you know what that one is already, but definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it. And then my weekly recommendation is called On a Magical Night, a film out of France that is hopefully getting a larger distribution this year, but already has a little bit of a minimal one on digital. So that's today's episode. And then the final segment, I'm going to be discussing the top 5 largest film industries in the world because this is a very global episode. I thought it would be fun to add some context around some of those films, and that's not really going to be ordered because it fluctuates so frequently, but usually the top 5 stays relatively stagnant, and it's also just important to talk about how that fits into the global box office and the movies that you're watching anyway, and sort of the just the dynamics of the relationships between all of them. So that's today's episode. I'm very excited to talk about these films. Overall, I like all of them, so I can't wait to get into it. So let's get into it. All right, so The Platform is a Netflix film out of Spain. It was released in March of this year, and it follows our protagonist, Goreng, who wakes up in a vertical prison that has an undetermined yet amount of floors, and each floor is one cell with 2 prisoners and a hole in the middle. And so every day, a platform of food, a large surplus of food, comes down from the top, where you get your food rations. And so if you are on a lower level, you're not going to get any food. And if you're on an upper level, you're going to get lots and lots of food. But if everything was rationed out equally, you could still make do if you were at the bottom. And every month is sort of randomly determined as to who is on what floor. So you hope every month to wake up in one of the upper levels. So it's a really creative premise right out the gate, a fantastic dystopian, somewhat of a mystery movie. Fairly interesting. The original title is El Hoyo, which more literally translates to the hole. So I find it kind of fascinating that the Spanish title focuses on the confines and the restraints of the world that we're in, and the American title kind of focuses more on the more fruitful side of things, the platform that brings food down, so the more positive aspect of it. So I think that's a pretty interesting idea right off the bat. And my initial thoughts on this film is that I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it most of the way through. I might have been a little bit shakier on the ending, and there were definitely some spots where I think maybe things could have been a little bit more intriguing. Things get monotonous sometimes, but overall, I think this is a very good film, and I really enjoyed it. So let's talk about why. So we're going to start with the screenplay, as always, and I think the screenplay is really well done. It's interesting because this film was actually originally conceived of as a play, which is very dialogue heavy most of the time, and upon initial understanding of the story, it seems to work pretty well as a play. It's confined to relatively one location, which always makes for an interesting idea for a film, but that usually translates better to stage sometimes because that's all you have. It's a very simple set, very, very little production design to be going off of as far as just like a surface level look at things. And so it works pretty well as a play, but like I said, those are fairly dialogue heavy, and this film actually is not all that dialogue heavy. There is some pretty clear moments of lots of dialogue, particularly in the beginning of the film, but a lot of foreign films tend to go this route if the anticipation for the film is large enough and the goal is to get a larger distribution, is less words the better, because then it can be universally understood without subtitles. So translating it from the stage to the screen and making more of a focus on the technical aspects of film without any of the actual dialogue, I think was really smart. And so it doesn't actually feel like a play translated to a film. It obviously feels like a film. And as far as a film goes, these are the kind of films that I really like that are high concept but relatively simplistic. So there's an implied much larger world going on here, right? So there's a prison that's pretty high tech, but also pretty dystopian, pretty maniacal. So there's this high concept of an idea, which is great, but the story itself is relatively simplistic, which is kind of the movies that I really like. It's very creative, but pretty easy to watch and enjoy and wrap your head around. Even if some of the things are metaphorical and ambiguous, which I would also say is a big part of why I enjoy films in the first place. So this one fits that really well. It's got that high concept, but the story itself is pretty simple, and the screenplay is pretty well structured. If you know anything about Joseph Campbell's sort of story structure, the hero's journey, this one follows that pretty well, and it actually follows it both in the screenplay and understanding the psyche of the characters, and also the literal placement of the characters. So you can kind of predict where things are going to be taking place as far as the levels go. It's seemingly at random in terms of like the world of the story, but if you understand story structure, you can kind of see that a lot of the lower lows and the higher highs translate to where they are in placement of the actual building at large, which I think is really clever. And going along with structure, both in terms of the screenplay and in even the themes of the story, lots of films about class, which is very clearly what this one is about. Class, economics, capitalism in particular, is told in a literal sense in the world of the story. So in this one, it's very vertical. There are literal class divisions as far as the actual height of things, and it's not very subtle. Like any foreign film, some things are probably bound to get lost in translation. I mean, you can even gather that from the translation of the title. You can actually watch this film in English on Netflix. It was dubbed over. I would recommend watching it subtitled. I recommend that for any foreign film just because the acting tends to feel more natural. And I think I've said this in a previous podcast. I actually tend to be a lot more focused on the film if I'm reading the subtitles. I'm not really thinking about anything other than the story of the film. So I would recommend watching it in subtitles, but if that's not something that you're able to do or enjoy doing as much, dubbed is just as good in a lot of ways, makes it a lot more accessible. But regardless, it has to get translated from Spanish to English in this case, if you're an English listener. And some things will get lost in translation. So a lot of times I forgive some of the lack of subtleties in the individual lines, in the individual spoken words, because of that translation gap. Some things are just not going to be as eloquently written in another language, just probably dumbed down a little bit, more simplistic. But in this case, it lacks some subtleties in just the overarching story, and sort of the structure of what's being said as opposed to what's actually being said. So there is sort of that lack of subtlety, but understanding just the story and that it is about capitalism and class, it is not very subtle. It's pretty clear that that's what it's about from the get-go, and the actual sort of like design of the story makes that pretty apparent. There's also, the reason I say that it lacks a little bit, it even lacks more subtlety than maybe some other foreign films, regardless of the translation, is because the beginning chunk is pretty exposition heavy. The protagonist, Garang, is pretty clearly a vessel for the audience. He doesn't know anything, or at least doesn't know all that much going in to the whole, but he gets all that explained to him from his cellmate Trimagasi, and even some of the things that his cellmate tells him are things that I'm skeptical that he would even know about. There's another somewhat central character, at least a recurring character throughout the film, and she appears in an early scene, and the knowledge that we have of this character from Garang's cellmate, I'm a little skeptical that he would know that. She doesn't seem to talk all that much, so I just think some of the exposition I think could have been done a little bit smoother, and there aren't a lot of, once you understand everything about the whole, which you understand fairly early on, there aren't a lot of surprises as far as the world. So there are surprises as far as like the relationship with the characters and maybe just the natural surprises that you would have, hopefully, in a well-written screenplay, which this is a pretty well-written one. But I would have wished that the exposition maybe came a little bit more fluidly as opposed to kind of all being dumped to us in the beginning. Moving on to the characters and the acting of the film, there are very strong, distinct characters, which is really nice. There's only a few, but they all have pretty clear personality traits that let us understand who they are very early on. There are a couple character quirks, particularly with Trimagasi, that seem not all that relevant to the story or his character. They just seem like something to set him apart. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I also could be wrong. I might just be not reading it correctly. I'm sure a lot of those decisions are being made for a reason. It just doesn't seem very apparent. But regardless, it does create a pretty distinct, strong character that then the acting translates to. So all of the acting is very strong. All of the side characters, because they have these very distinct characters, and their motivations are pretty well written, their character traits are, again, very distinct. There's a level of largeness and theatricality to a lot of their writing. I actually wrote down theatricality before knowing that this was a play, so it comes across very well. There's sort of this over-the-top nature with a lot of these side characters that doesn't go too far. It's not overacting. That's why I kind of use the word theatricality, because it's more of a theater type of acting where it's a little bit more over-the-top, but still just as nuanced. And I think that complements our protagonist really well because he is a lot more reserved and a lot of his acting is much more internal, works a lot with the camera and the directing, and we can understand sort of his internal decisions as opposed to anything that he's actually saying out loud. And that definitely continues throughout the film. He's much more dialogue heavy in the beginning, and as he starts to get worn down, he speaks a lot less. Moving on to the production design of this film, it's very strong. This film is all about the production design because the world of the film is so strong. It's very important to have a pretty distinct set, and this one it does. It only really has one set. There's a couple other locations, and there are multiple cells, but all of those cells look the same. So there's only one location, and even though it's really simple, that doesn't mean that it's not that doesn't mean that it's lazy or not relevant to the story, because the simplicity of it actually makes it a lot more brutal and feels a lot more violent because there is no distinct characteristics of it. There's no distinction as to what class you're on. The only distinction comes in the actual sort of relationship between the other cells, which I think is pretty important. And as far as iconography goes, it does a pretty good job making itself distinct. The square platform, the movement of the platform, the lighting of the actual cells make it a pretty distinct look. I wouldn't confuse it with any other things like this. Kind of things that come to mind would maybe be like Cube or any of the Saw franchise with certain traps that might happen, because all of those can be, or sometimes it can be simplistic. Later on, they get a little bit more complex. But this one is very distinct, and I think you would be able to pick it out of a crowd of other stories that might be somewhat like this. So the set is very relevant to the story. I think they do a pretty good job with making the lighting a bit more creative because the cell is so structured and mundane that you could easily have just kind of a gray lighting palette with no variation, no variety, and that's it. But they don't do that. They have a kind of a binary lighting scale with reds and greens, particularly more moving with reds, this is a very symbolic movie. It's a very metaphorical movie, and so red is a pretty symbolic color. I would argue that it's one of the most distinct colors when you're thinking about symbolism, particularly for a story like this, with passion and violence and things like that. So it's pretty important to have that. The production design also with the food, when you actually get to see it being made or just the first level, the platter, it's beautiful, and juxtaposing that with how gray and somewhat terrifying the set of the or of the hole, the tower is a pretty good relationship in understanding the themes of this film. The camera in this film isn't all that distinct to me. There aren't really any clear sort of heightened creative choices being made other than that of the use of close-ups focusing on Garang. The entire film focuses on Garang. We don't see many events that aren't kind of through his eyes. So pretty clear that it's a subjective storytelling device for most of the film, other than when we get images of either the food being made or other levels that we do get every now and then. We also understand that through some of his internal monologue with some characters that come back, whether or not they're still in the story at large. And so the film uses close-up pretty effectively because a lot of Garang's story is internal and not said out loud. It's important to have the camera be focusing on him most of the time and focusing on close-ups, which it does, and it does that pretty effectively. It also uses these close-ups really well in a lot of the montages. So I want to talk about that in terms of the editing, because the editing is really smart in this film. So every cell, every level that Garang is on is for a month, and that can get kind of boring, for sure. You get sort of the initial understanding of what that means, like what level he's on and what that means for him and the other characters in the story. So if he's on level 170, that's going to be pretty brutal, pretty hard to get through. If he's on level 5, it's going to be pretty easy. So it's good to understand that from the get-go, but the rest of the month, after the first couple days or so, is going to get pretty boring if we stay there. So there's a lot of movement in the story. So I think we get to about 5 levels, maybe, 4 to 6. I know he's supposed to be there for 6, so I think it's about 5 levels that we actually get through. And when we're at the level, we get a pretty effective use of montage on pretty much every level. So understanding that moves the pacing along really well, so it doesn't actually get boring. So we understand what that means. We get the initial couple, I say scenes, but it's divvied up. Yeah, scenes. It's divvied up pretty well. So we get a few couple elongated scenes with dialogue or just important story beats in the beginning of each floor, and then we get a longer montage, and that stays pretty consistent, which makes a really nice structure. So it's a really good use of editing here. But with editing, the thing that stands out to me the most is the sound editing and the sound design. So I use the word brutal early on in this review because the film feels very brutal, both in the environment, and then we also get that with the sound design. So the sound design with picking at the food, eating the food, is disgusting. It's gross. And a lot of this film is gross. There's definitely a content warning if you're kind of squeamish. Don't watch this, or at least watch it with your eyes closed or watch it with a friend. But the sound design is it's much louder than a lot of films. There's a very big focus on it, and it makes it just really gross. And so when it's loud and slimy, and it's just a very creative use of sound design, we're really focused in on the relationship between the people and the food and how that translates to what floor they're on, their understanding of their place in society, and that the administration, which is sort of a placeholder for any other form of either government or societal confines that we might be in, creates that relationship and creates the struggle of a lot of these characters. So I thought that that was a very effective use of sound design and very creative and really emphasizes a lot of what this film is about. I also thought that the score was really creative. So the score mainly focuses on orchestral instruments, particularly strings. There's a pretty strong motif from the very beginning of the film with a violin or a viola. And then there's also a lot of use of mallet-based instruments. It's hard for me to pick out. I'm not a musician, so I think it's like a xylophone or a glockenspiel or something like that. So that type of instrument is very commonly associated with childhood and innocence and purity, and so having that pretty starkly contrast to the very violent events of the film and the really intense emotions of the film makes it pretty effective, and you kind of reassociate it with, as opposed to younger innocence or naivety or purity, that then becomes savagery. And so it's sort of two sides of the same coin, which I really like. And so it emphasizes that theme, and it does so in a pretty creative way. That's not something that I would have chosen as the score for this film, but it works really well. And then as far as the directing goes, it's directed by Galdar Castelu Urrutia, and he has a really strong understanding of symbolism and theme that translates throughout the entire film. This film is very ambiguous by the end, which is something that I wasn't really expecting because of the fact that the beginning is so strictly laid out as far as the exposition goes. Making that transition to make it super ambiguous was not something that I was really expecting, and I don't know if it fit as well with the tone. I would have liked the beginning to have more nuance and subtlety and be less explicitly stated, because then that ending I think would have fit a lot better, because I love ambiguous endings, but that switch from being really, really well laid out to not laid out at all, I don't know if that works as effectively. But he does have that sense of symbolism and theme that he wants to bring throughout the entire film, which does even occur in the beginning with a lot of the relationships between the characters. So having that then influence the ambiguous nature of the ending does make it a pretty natural conclusion to the film, and feels like a very personal response from the director to the film. So I do really like that. He also has an understanding of the international market, which I sort of stated with a lot of lack of dialogue in some ways, focus on montage editing, and the language of film as opposed to actual written language. So he's a very competent film director. This is the first film that I've seen from him. I definitely would like to go out and watch some more. Very solid direction. And overall, the film is very solid. I really enjoyed this film. Like I said, it wasn't my favorite ending. I wish that had kind of either translated to the beginning or the beginning had translated to the end. I think that tonal switch, that narrative switch, isn't as strong as it could be. So I'm going to give this film a strong 7 out of 10. I did really enjoy it, despite a couple little bit story things, and it's also a little bit hard to get through sometimes because it's a little gross. So be aware of that. If you're squeamish, don't like the sight of blood, I would definitely look up a content warning for this film, because it's a little bit difficult. But that's The Platform. Really enjoyed it. Would definitely recommend as far as a foreign film from this year. But now we're going to get into some other foreign films, both from this year and last year. So next up is Parasite, the most recent film from Bong Joon-ho out of South Korea. And then my weekly recommendation is On a Magical Night, which is from France, that came out earlier this year, that not a lot of people know about, so I would love to, I can't wait to recommend that to you guys. And then wait till the final segment where I talk about the international film market and the top 5 biggest film industries and what that means for film and the future of film. So right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I've given my review of The Platform. Totally forgot what I just gave my review on for a second. And I'm about to give my review of Parasite as well as On a Magical Night. And stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I talk about the international film market and the top 5 largest film industries in the world. So right now we're talking about Parasite, the Best Picture winner at the 2019 Oscars. Feels like a very long time ago now, but it was still this year. Also won Best Director for Bong Joon-ho, Best Original Screenplay, and of course Best Foreign Film. It would be hard to lose Best Foreign Film and win Best Picture. I have to imagine. So a lot of people, I assume, know about this film. I think a lot of people have seen this film, but also it might be something that flew under people's radar because it was a foreign film and may not even know where to watch it, but it is streaming right now on Hulu, so it's free if you got Hulu, so I would highly recommend it. Otherwise, I think you can get it on Amazon for a couple dollars, $5 or $6. And it is well worth it. So, Parasite follows a family in South Korea, the Kims, a poor family, who their son gets a job as a tutor with a much wealthier family, the Parks, and then finds ways to get the rest of his family employed by the Parks, but without them even knowing that the Kims are even related. So another high concept film, and I love this film. It's fantastic. I rewatched it with my family recently because I had seen it in theaters. I saw it in theaters twice, actually. I'm a big fan of Bong Joon-ho. I really liked Snowpiercer. That's one of my favorites from him. I also recommend The Host from him, one of his first films. That's also in Korean. And so I was very excited for this film, highly anticipating it. And given that I'm kind of a film geek, among the film world, this had a lot of buzz. People knew that this was going to be a film that got lots and lots of accolades. And so I did my best not to look up the plot. I didn't know anything about this film going in, which sometimes is a catch-22 because sometimes I go into films knowing the plot, and so I think that creates my expectations. So I'm like, oh, I don't want to have any expectations, therefore I won't know the plot. But if I'm expecting it to be good, not knowing the plot almost ups the expectations because I have no idea what to expect, which makes me think that I'm going to enjoy the experience more. So it's a little bit difficult. And I think on the first watch that definitely influenced me. I loved it. Don't get me wrong, but I think there were parts of it that I didn't love as much because I thought the story was going to go in one direction, as opposed to another. I actually thought that it was going to be a monster movie or have some creature in it because Bong Joon-ho had done The Host, which is a creature feature, and this film was called Parasite, and people were talking about how scary and intense it was. So that was my expectations going in. But regardless, I loved this film, and I have grown to love it even more over time. It's one that when you sit with and you think about the actual story and the filmmaking of it really grows on you. At first, I think I thought Jojo Rabbit was probably my favorite film nominated for Best Picture, and then over time I've realized that definitely Parasite is my favorite film nominated from this year. So this year it actually went to the Best Picture, which is really nice. But that's enough about my ideas on the film, or my personal subjective ideas on the film. Let's talk about the actual film. So, talking about subtlety, as far as The Platform goes. Oh, actually, The Platform and this have a lot in common. So, I'll start with that. Both are a class critique. Both are very focused on the vertical aspect of class, both the economic idea of being in a higher status and also the literal interpretation of what that means to be elevated and to be higher. And so there's a lot of parallels between The Platform and Parasite, particularly on the idea of capitalism and what that means for people at the bottom versus people on the top. And so I think that is super cool to watch them in tandem. I would recommend if you want to do a movie night or a movie weekend or something where you talk about both, seeing both interpretations is very cool. And this one is a little bit more subtle than The Platform, which I thought was interesting because that's kind of hard to do sometimes when you translate, like I've said. It's hard to be subtle. And this one is very subtle, at least in the dialogue and when you first watch it. The idea of the verticality of it is pretty apparent, but it's not necessarily thrown in your face. It's not an actual building that is vertically higher. It's just the idea of the Kims maybe being in a lower level, and that comes through later on in the film with certain events, for sure. And I think some of the subtleties that we gain in this actually comes from Bong Joon-ho doing some English language films. So he is from South Korea. And so he started off his career with doing Korean films, but then made the transition to do a couple English language films with Snowpiercer and Okja. And then he has now since gone back to Korean films, which I really appreciate. I like when people make films strictly speaking about their culture, because I think when you get down to specifics of certain things, it can make it more universal in a lot of ways. I really enjoy Snowpiercer. I actually think it might be my favorite from him. I don't know. Parasite and Snowpiercer are pretty tied. So he's very good at making English language films, but I like that now he's back to making films in South Korea. And because he has an understanding of the English language and how stories are told, and clearly an international market, I think he knows that that's something that he's trying to appeal to as well, because the South Korean market is not nearly as big as the international and particularly the American market is. And because he made some English language films, I actually think we get some of the subtleties that we might not have were it made were Bong Joon-ho not to make it, or somebody else not to make it. But I'll talk about this when I talk about directing. It definitely could not have been made by anybody else. Bong Joon-ho is a very talented, I was going to say competent, because he is competent, but he's even more than that. He's very much more than that. He's just a very phenomenal director. He's one of my favorites. So it's a lot more subtle, and that lends itself to understanding the story where you can gain the themes, particularly on a rewatch, but it's much more focused on the actual story and how that creates an idea of what the themes and motifs may be that you can take away from the film. So it doesn't nail you over the head with it necessarily in a lot of ways, but because the story is so strong and it's so focused on the story, the themes then kind of subtly seep their way into your head, and gaining an empathy for the characters will get that sort of message across that Bong Joon-ho wants to convey. And I had said that in the platform, some of the plot points could be predicted potentially. In this one, not at all. I had no clue where this story was going. And that's always nice, because I didn't know what it was about in the first place. And when you figure out what it's about, that it's sort of like this infiltration movie in the beginning, I was like, oh my god, this is so fun. This is clever. Fun in the sense like, no, it's fun. It's enjoyable. You're like, yeah, I want them to get into this family. This is awesome. But Bong Joon-ho has a really strong understanding of structure. He's made plenty of movies, so obviously he knows that, but he also is very well studied as far as just the world of film, and you can tell, because to have a really subversive film that kind of subverts expectations, diverts what you may be expecting the story to go, you have to have a strong understanding of structure, and so he's more focused on the structure translating to the emotion of these characters as opposed to what's actually happening. So you really have no idea where this story is going, which creates a phenomenal, like, twist. I say twist, but there's no way you could have predicted it, even if it had been something else. So there's a crazy sort of, like, tonal shift, narrative shift towards the end of the second act, so middle kind of beginning of the third act of the film, that then changes the tone and creates a very intense climax. And I said that I had a lot of fun in the beginning, and it's actually pretty funny. There are some pretty funny lines. The beginning is a lot of fun, and then when that tonal switch happens, it actually doesn't really feel out of the blue because of all of these subtle ways that the themes and ideas have already woven their way into the film, even when it's trying to be a little lighter and a little more fun, a little bit more enjoyable in some ways. So it balances that tone really well, which is obviously a hard thing to do. As far as the acting goes, in here the acting is extremely strong, particularly the chemistry among both families, but particularly the Kims, because they just have such good chemistry with each other, whether it be when things are really, really good, going really well, but you just get the sense that this is a family. There's that camaraderie, but there's also that kind of nagging at each other, and you just get the sense that it's a real family. The father, Kang Ho Song, is somebody that has worked with Bong Joon-ho very often. He's in most of his films. He's definitely in all the films that I've seen from Bong Joon-ho. And all of the actors in this film, as far as I'm aware, or at least most of them, are pretty prolific South Korean actors. So the acting is obviously really strong, has that sense of both an internal motivation and who we understand that they actually are, and then the social contract that they have to uphold within their relationship to other characters. So we can see that there are kind of two sides to these characters, one that has to obey the rules of the society that they're in, and one that may be a little bit more natural, particularly in that family dynamic. So I think that's something that is definitely in every film, because everyone kind of has an inherent understanding of what that social contract is, but here it's made very apparent by seeing the characters in multiple different settings and seeing it also from the lens of just another culture, because that social contract is potentially a little bit different, but translates pretty universally to at least the United States, and I would assume the rest of, or at least a lot of the world. Another thing that may go a little bit more with the directing side of things, but it also pretty clearly translates to the acting. Everything in this film is influenced by class, is influenced by the theme of that, and then also just the social structure and the dynamic of what that means for all of these characters. So that kind of goes into the whole social contract thing, but all of the acting is influenced by where these characters are in a class setting. So it's pretty interesting that both families are relatively similar as far as the dynamics go. One family is a little bit younger than the next, but you can kind of compare them pretty clearly. And so having that comparison then be thrown completely out the window by the class that they're in, and having them be a very different family is something that gets you to understand both the story and the themes of the film, which just shows how smart of a director and creator Bong Joon-ho is. I'm going to be raving about him a lot in this review. I just think he's one of my favorites. But moving on to the production design, much like The Platform, this is a vertical film. It's told in the sense of the higher class is literally higher and the lower class is literally lower. That might be something that is sometimes exaggerated in film for the Platform, but in here it feels very natural, and it feels like that's actually the way things are, because in a lot of ways it is. And so both in South Korea and in a lot of other places in the world, people that are in poverty are literally lower than people who are not. And so that's something that isn't really explored in film as much. The actual social and physical impacts of that, and then a lot of times the natural ecological impacts of it. So I think that's a really creative thing to be exploring in this film, and it's a little bit more subtle in The Platform as far as the verticality of it goes. Additionally, the set is crazy. The house is extremely iconic now, I would think, or at least farther on down the road. It's a very distinct set that each room has a very clear idea and message going on with every scene that takes place in it. It's an open layout that then translates to how these characters may be feeling in the setting that they're in, and then there's a lot of like hidden parts of it. So it's a pretty good symbolic aspect of just the social hierarchy and the class divide at large. And then something that translates both to the production design of the set and the cinematography is the geometrical storytelling that's going on here. So you can tell the house with sort of the height of it all and the way that it's built is very geometrical, with a lot of lines, a lot of squares. And so with the framing of these scenes, you're taught really early on in film school that frames, lines within frames are really important and mean something. They're usually not there by accident. So if somebody's in a door, or if somebody is two characters are divided by a literal line on the set, it means some sort of symbolic relationship or divide going on. And here, so sometimes that can be really apparent. It can be pretty obvious when it's something that you're looking for. But in here, it's obvious in some places, but because the house is so geometrical and that just becomes something that kind of blends into the set, and we're not as aware of where some of those lines are, it becomes a really subtle way that the camera and the framing creates that class divide. So in a lot of ways, the lines that are being created are literally lines of class between the characters, or represented between the characters. So a thing that's stated multiple times in the film by the parks is that they don't want the people that they've employed to cross the line. So there's a class line and a social line they don't want them to cross. And then the framing creates these literal lines that they either won't cross, can't cross, or when the story requires it will cross. And then that means something. So it's super subtle, but it's very creative, and just expertly done. Like, it's crazy. I can't explain how difficult that is to kind of like just do when you're doing all these other great stuff and focus on. So there's just so much care and focus taken to this story. And that's one of the things that I think exemplifies that most. The cinematography is also very voyeuristic. I'll talk about this a little bit in the next film too, but a lot of shots are shown through windows from a more outside perspective, so it feels like you're actually kind of a fly on the wall, that you're watching it in, and it creates sort of a sense of, or like an ominous sense, something that's a little more creepy, that you maybe shouldn't be seeing some of the things that you are seeing. So it creates some really good suspense. So I think that's a really effective use of the camera. The editing does a really good job balancing both the character and the plot equally. So there are really strong characters in this film, but there is also a really strong plot, and the editing of the film, the structure of the film doesn't take precedent for one or the other. It focuses both on cutting on character moments, character reactions, but then also cutting in a way that the narrative beats feel natural and don't feel forced. So it has a really good balance of the story, and so then that makes all of the cuts and all of the editings makes the editing and all of the cuts feel very intentional. So it's not like there's minimal cuts so you are aware of those cuts, but because everything is crafted so meticulously here, that all of those cuts serve a purpose and aren't there just to serve just be functional in any way. That they're all done either to serve the character or the story, and both are kind of equally served by the end of the film, which I think is really, really nice. Sound design here, I think, is one of the things that is, I'm not going to say not as strong, because everything in this film is strong, but it just doesn't stand out nearly as much. The score is really beautiful. It's really intense, even in scenes that may not feel like they should be intense, but then by the end, obviously become a lot more intense. And then scenes where mundane actions go on are then heightened by the score, because of how intense it is, and you understand the actual severity of the scene playing out. So the score is really really beautiful. I keep saying nice. I'm sorry. It's just very beautiful, and very important to the story at large. And then the sound design is really natural. So nothing feels like it is focused on being super outlandish, out there, creative, different. All of it feels like very natural sound design. So then when there are these moments of violence or just these sort of like more brutal moments, those are then accented by the sound design. And so since we haven't gotten those accents earlier on in the film, those feel a lot more impactful. So I've focused on the directing kind of throughout this whole thing, but everything is influenced by the theme of the film, and so everything is just enhanced that much more. He has a grasp of technical filmmaking, and because he's so focused on both the story and the themes and motifs and messages of it, everything then all of those technical aspects are then influenced by that theme. So he just has a really nice grasp of how the relationship between film and theme sort of coincide. And so it creates something that then becomes very universal and people can understand in any language. Also, I want to add that maybe this is a comparison that shouldn't be being made. Comparisons are hard sometimes because you might be undermining one or the other. I hope that this is not the case, but Bong Joon-ho feels to me very Hitchcockian. Feels kind of like the next Hitchcock. Next, I don't know. Hitchcock's been dead for a while, but I'm a big Hitchcock fan and sort of master of suspense. Bong Joon-ho knows how to make these very suspenseful, very intense, edge of your seat scenes. So a fun comparison to draw there. So if you're a Hitchcock fan, I'd recommend Bong Joon-ho for sure. So that's Parasite. Love this film. So I'm going to give this film a strong 9, and it's probably going to grow on me to be a soft 10, but right now it's sitting at kind of a strong 9. So really love this film. Bong Joon-ho is one of my favorite creators, so anything by him I would recommend. I'm definitely going to go out and watch some more from him because talking about it has just made me even more excited. So That's Parasite. I recommend if you haven't seen it. It's streaming right now on Hulu. And for the rest of the episode, next up is my weekly recommendation, which is On a Magical Night, a film out of France from earlier this year. And then stay tuned until the very end, where I talk about the film industry at large, the international film industry and box office, and the top 5 largest film industries around the world. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my review of The Platform and Parasite. I will now be giving my weekly recommendation, which is On a Magical Night, and then stay tuned until the last segment where I talk about the international film industry and the top 5 film industries in the whole world. So right now, we're talking about On a Magical Night, which is a film out of France from earlier this year, released May 8th, 2020. According to IMDb, I don't know where it was released for that. I think it was released like on one digital site then. But I saw this one at a virtual film festival, the Annapolis Film Festival, and I was very lucky to have seen this film because it has not been widely distributed yet. But according to the official website of the production company, it seems it is releasing on digital on August 11th, which is very exciting because now I can recommend it for anybody to go check it out in a little bit less than a month, because it is currently my favorite film of 2020. I think it is a really creative story and it's very well told. So I love this film. I think it's my biggest recommendation for the year. I think it's something that anybody can enjoy. And it's something that will hopefully diversify your film going if you're somebody who generally just kind of watches American films. So this is something that is still pretty universal and really beautiful. So On a Magical Night follows Maria, an older woman who gets caught for cheating by her husband of 20 years. So she decides to leave and goes to the hotel across the street to room 212 and encounters her husband from 20 years prior, and then has to kind of grapple with the social and relationship implications of cheating and infidelity, and then the love that she still has for her husband. So it's, again, a very high concept film. This one is the most different from the past two, because the past two were about class and capitalism. This is about infidelity and love. So this film is also called Chambre 212. I'm not going to remember how to say 212 in French. I took French for far too long to not remember, but regardless, here we are. And I kind of like that name better. I wish that it had been like Room 212 for the American release, but it is On a Magical Night, which this film takes place over the course of one night. And like I've said with the plot description, Maria finds herself kind of entangled with her former husband, or her husband of a former age when they first met, fell in love, and then also the relationships that her husband may have had with other women, and then the relationships that she has had with other men in the past. So it really grapples with monogamy, marriage, and then of course infidelity. So it's a super high concept creative premise, which I love. It creates sort of a light and fun atmosphere in the beginning. The beginning of the film starts out with one of her escapades. It seems that she does this fairly often. I'll talk about this a little bit with the cinematography, but it translates to the screenplay. Even though it's something that she does fairly often, she is not framed in a negative light almost ever. She's only framed in a negative light in the sense that any character should be. Any character is flawed and critiqued, but she's never judged. In the screenplay, it's told. I wouldn't say it's told from her perspective. It's told sort of about her perspective. You literally see a lot of her internal monologue. So in that sense, it's told from her perspective. And also, yeah, I'm kind of talking myself out of it. It's told from her perspective. But there also is the idea of objectiveness throughout sort of the film and the beginning of the film. So she's never framed judgmentally, and so since it's from her perspective, I think we get that sense of forgiveness that she might be cutting herself a little bit of slack, which is important in creating a sympathetic character, which we definitely get. So that beginning of the film is light and fun. There are some pretty good jokes. It's definitely pretty funny, I thought, but it's also really cleverly funny. It's creatively funny. A lot of those jokes come from the screenplay. Obviously the acting is great here, and the performances lend itself to the screenplay and sort of enhance it, but a lot of those jokes don't feel like they're improv or feel forced in any way, so the strong comedy comes from the strong script, but then it has this really gradual degradation. So both in Parasite and The Platform, there are plot points that create the tonal switches, and they tend to go up and down a lot, where one scene might be lighter than the other, the next scene is really dark, and then the tonal switches are pretty severe, may create a little bit of tonal whiplash, but in here there's a pretty gradual lowering of happiness. It starts out light and fun, and by the end it gets a lot more serious, a lot more introspective, which is really important for the story being told here, and the introspection doesn't come at the expense of any of the levity, lightness, because that still comes from sort of the character of Maria, who's very well written, and she just has this air of not carelessness, but sort of a carefree attitude, and that then lends itself to how her introspection plays out. And so although there is the gradual degradation of lightness in tone, the heaviness is slowly, subtly woven in the beginning, and then the lightness is also apparent in the end. It's just that one becomes stronger than the other throughout the film. So the tone works really well as far as the themes go and the characters' responses to all of them. So the performances here are great. Maria has a really strong character, and we see her throughout most of the film, almost every scene, and so we get the nuances of all of her character, and all of that is brought to life by Chiara Mastroianni. Hope I didn't get that wrong. I think I got that right. It seems like I got that right. But her performance is really strong. She works with the director Christophe Honoré very often. She's been in 3 or 4 of his films. So they seem to work really well together, and she just has a really strong sense of character, brings the lightness to some of those serious moments, but then always has that sort of reflectiveness, whether it be in just the air that she brings herself to, just how she holds herself, or in those literal moments of introspection. You kind of get that idea that she's probably being fairly critical of herself most of the time, even though she may be doing things that go against some of that introspection. So her character is really important to the rest of the film too, because all of the characters' relationships are built off of that, and because it's somewhat told from her perspective, all of those other characters are influenced by her, and so all the performances are influenced by her really well. The guy that plays her husband, Vincent Lacoste, when he's 20, has sort of this confident, definitely 20-something ego going on, which makes it very enjoyable to compare that to where she is in her life. And we see the 40-year-old version of the husband played by Benjamin Bioli earlier on in the film, and so juxtaposing those two performances is really fascinating because one of those performances is influenced by Maria's internal perception of her husband, and then one is supposedly the more objective perception of the husband. So very creative relationship character dynamic. The production design here is really cool because it takes place basically in 2 locations, and those locations feel or look small but feel very big. So there's a couple different rooms, and those rooms symbolize different things. I wrote this down as far as the directing goes, but I'll talk about it here. The director, Christoph, creates these really big spaces out of the smallness of those rooms because of the relationship between the characters, the empty space that's being used, and the actual sort of symbolism of each room. And all of those rooms look a little bit different, but are sort of just variations of each other because it's a hotel or an apartment. And so that kind of translates itself to how Maria may see her husband or the other men that she's slept with because of the fact that they might be variations of each other or even just variations of her. So I think that actually translates to the story really well. That also fits really nicely into the cinematography. So there is that sense of distance going on, both so the literal distance of the characters translates to the emotional distance of some of those characters, and so the empty space is framed really well. The characters sort of are placed in these small spaces that then, because of the blocking and the framing, feel a lot bigger and a lot farther away than they actually are. So the blocking here is really strong, and so is the framing. The editing in this film follows how the screenplay goes, where it's that natural degradation. So it's obviously a very thoughtful screenplay, and so it starts with that high energy and then translates to a little bit lower of an energy by the end of the film. And the editing goes in that way too. So the beginning of the film is quick, paced really nicely, has pretty exciting opening, and then the middle feels a little bit more flat, feels a little bit more focusing on how these characters respond to each other, and so it feels a little bit slower. You're focused on the relationship between these characters, not necessarily focused on the cuts of things. And then by the end of the film, things start to pick the pace up a little bit. And so it almost has this bell curve of pacing, which happens in a lot of films, but in here starts with exciting, goes lower, ends with exciting, which sometimes it can be the opposite, which I kind of liked. The editing also is fairly reactionary, which I like. It's focused less on the dialogue that's being said, the characters saying specific things, and more on the reactions of the characters not saying things, which is not as common, particularly for more mainstream blockbuster films. And so I really like that it's more focused on the internal side and the reflections of all of these characters as opposed to maybe what's actually being said in some of the scenes. As far as sound goes, a lot of classical music is being used here, which creates a very romantic sense, because this is kind of a romantic film, but I think it's just as much. So if you've been listening to my episodes for a little bit, I talked a lot about 500 Days of Summer, and this film is honestly, I think you can draw a lot of parallels between this film. And so one of those parallels is that it's kind of more of a coming-of-age film than it is a relationship film, but you still want that sense of romance. And given that it takes place in France, and you already got that, and so the classical music fits with sort of the strong Eurocentric narrative being brought to the film, and then also the romance of the film. So the classical music, I think, works really well here, very grandiose, for how grandiose those emotions may feel for Maria and some of the other characters. So a lot of what I wrote down about the directing I've said earlier, so he understands his actors really well, and then particularly Chiara, who he has worked with very often. They have a really strong bond, it seems, as far as filmmaking goes, and so he knows how to create the character around the actress, which is really nice, and just has a really strong sense of character. And then also just his use of blocking and relationships has creates these really big spaces and these big ideas out of maybe some smaller actual literal space. And so that's On a Magical Night. Final note, there are some really nice shots here that are not just functional but really creative. There's one shot that feels one of my favorites of the year that feels kind of like a snow globe. I think you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So if you watch the film. So really recommend this film. If you want to watch it right now, you can buy it at filmlink.org, filmlinc.org. It's, I think, about $15, which is probably the price of a normal movie ticket in some places. But I would recommend watching it if you can swing that. And if you can't or want to wait just a little bit, where it's probably going to be a little bit cheaper, it's going to be available for digital on August 11th. Amazon, iTunes, Vimeo. So super recommend this film. It's my favorite of the year. I'm very excited for the rest of this year, but I think this one will probably stay up there for a while. And so I'm going to give this one a strong 9 out of 10. I thought it was great. Everything is really well told. Everything fits in a pretty concise narrative of only 87 minutes. So really recommend On a Magical Night. Check it out if you can, when you can. And so for the next segment, I'm going to be talking about the top 5 film industries, biggest film industries in the world, and what that means for film, because it's a very global, worldly episode. So right now, we're going to take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in, I have given my reviews of The Platform, Parasite, and On a Magical Night, all foreign films. And so now I'll be talking about the top 5 biggest film industries in the world and some of the relationships and how that creates the movies that we're watching. So this is a really exciting thing for me. I really like understanding the world of film outside of the actual films that we're watching, because it's really important to know that and just know the context of things, because obviously things exist outside of a vacuum. The films that we're watching definitely are not outside of society and culture and economics. And given that we're now kind of in a lot more of a global world in a lot of ways than we have been in the past, and in the past for film, it's really important to understand how that translates to nowadays and how film is changing. So it's something that I'm really passionate about, really excited about. And so this top 5 list is not really in any specific order. The order that I found that I'll be talking about it in is sort of the most recent that I could find. It sort of fluctuates fairly, it fluctuates a lot as far as who's where, but the top 5 tends to stay pretty similar. And I'm really going to be focusing mostly, I think, on the top 2. So, because they tend to be just the most relevant. But starting off, biggest also kind of means most films produced and most amount of global box office financial revenue. So it's kind of cumulative. Yeah, so I just want to get that out of the way. It's not a clear quota to be met to make it in here. These are just some of the most relevant film industries, largest film industries for film today. And what's interesting is that all 3 of the films that I've talked about here are not on this list as far as the industry goes. South Korea and France sometimes make it to the top 5. Usually are in the top 10. Spain can sometimes be in the top 10 too. So South Korea and France tend to come out with a lot of films that get a lot of critical acclaim, particularly in the United States. But as far as large box office goes, both tend to hover around $1.5–2 billion of revenue each year. And so that's nowhere near some of the other countries on this list, but it can sometimes make it to the top 5. So number 5 right now, as it seems, is the cinema of Japan. And so that's the second biggest in Asia. It also has some of the most prolific creators of all time. Somebody who you may have heard about if you are in film school or follow any film directors, Akira Kurosawa, is from Japan, and a lot of the tropes and techniques that we understand both in story and technical filmmaking was created by Kurosawa. So Japan is a very prolific industry in terms of history of film. As far as nowadays goes, they tend to be a lot more lucrative in the world of animation. So anime, 2D animation, hand-drawn animation, Studio Ghibli, obviously being one of the pioneers of that. But as far as revenue goes, they tend to also be around that 2 billion mark, which is why they can fluctuate with France and South Korea. But they have a lot of my favorite films coming out of the global box office. But that's why they are at number 5. Number 4 is the United Kingdom. I actually couldn't find a lot of information about the United Kingdom, oddly enough. They, I think, just tend to be some of the biggest contributors to global box office because they're in English. And it's sort of inevitable to talk about this without talking about how the United States just tends to be the most financially profitable industry, and so having films in English is obviously really important to getting that global box office because you're going to get the US market. And so the United Kingdom, I think, translates pretty well to that. And so then we also get a lot of really prolific actors out of the UK. There's also a lot of films for the United States that film in the United Kingdom. So that's why they tend to be in this top 5 list. And they also just have a really strong media presence in the world at large and in the UK and Europe. So that's why they're on this list at number 4. Number 3, I'm going to talk about a little bit, but also something that I couldn't find as much information on, at least in English. But number 3 on this list is India, Bollywood. They have the most number of movies that come out of the world every year. They tend to be between 1,200 and 1,400 movies a year, which is absolutely crazy. They have just tons of films coming out because India is such a big country, and there's also so many diverse groups of people in India and so many different languages. So those films are also translated in many different languages, created in many different languages, tend to be around 20 languages just in India, as opposed to the US, which would translate it to maybe 1 or 2 languages when creating movies for India. They have since started the United States has since started translating films into multiple languages when going to India, because they now realize the Indian box office is pretty big and they can get a lot of money from the Indian box office. So for the past couple years, American films have made their way into the top 10 as far as Indian box office goes. Many times films from India, from Bollywood, tend to be the highest grossing. So there's still a pretty strong presence of keeping Indian film in India and making that the most lucrative film industry for the Indian market. But the US has definitely kind of been infiltrating their way into the Indian box office, and there's a pretty strong push from Indian creators to keep a lot of the biggest films be from India. So there's a pretty strong presence as far as creatively there. Another pretty important thing to note for India, they have the smallest ratio of screens to residents, which is, you can kind of predict that because of how big a country India is. But if you look at, there's usually 1 screen for about 8,000 residents in the United States, and compare that to 1 screen for almost 100,000 residents in India. So that's also just something that's interesting to note. But now we're going to move on to number 2 and number 1, which are competing now way more than they used to, and it's really important to understand the relationship between these two. I could definitely ramble about these two for a long time, so I will try not to. I'm going to try and keep this within the next 5-10 minute mark. But number 2 is China. And China is the fastest growing film market in the world, and it is impossible to understand the future of the film industry without understanding China. They're the second highest grossing, obviously, in the world. Like I said, the U.S. film industry. So there's not actually sort of up-to-date statistics. Most of the statistics that I found are from 2018. But the U.S. tends to get about $11 to $12 billion of revenue from the film industry every year, and now China is about 9 to 10. So they didn't used to be that. They used to be a lot lower than that, but they are building almost 25 screens a day. At least back in 2018 they were, and I assume that growth rate is relatively similar because the film industry is just a much larger growing industry in China. And so I'll say number 1, probably expected it by now, is the United States. And so now I just want to talk a little bit about how the U.S. and Chinese market is creating a different film world and film industry than we may have understood in the past. So it's expected, it's predicted that the Chinese market is going to overtake the U.S. market as far as annual revenue. I think the prediction is about $15 billion by 2023. That's minus COVID. So COVID kind of throws a wrench in a lot of these things. We don't know what that means for the United States and China yet, and for the film industry at large. So bear in mind that things could change pretty drastically. But right now, because the U.S. has been getting so much revenue from film for so long, and it's the largest and the oldest film industry in the world, and now China is quickly overtaking that, the U.S. is catering a lot of films and a lot of big budget films to China. So because the Chinese market is so large, a lot of film industries in the United States, or a lot of film companies in the United States know that it is important to get their film distributed in China. And China actually has a quota that they have to meet, or a limit, more likely, a limit that they have to get to for foreign films. So they keep most of their films within China, but they tend to be about 30 to 40. So the number changes. A while ago it was like 20, then by 2012 it was about 32, and now they're kind of fluctuating around 38 films from other countries. And so the US wants to be they want to be all, but they can't be all of them. India usually gets about 4, some other countries get 1 or 2, but the US, given that they make some of the biggest films of the year every year, they get a lot of their films in. And one thing that's changing is that Chinese film companies are co-financing US films, and so that means the US films can skirt around the international limit. So if they're being co-financed by Chinese film companies, then they are technically considered Chinese films, and so they don't fall into the foreign film market. But the biggest difference between the U.S. film market and the Chinese film market is the idea of censorship. So there's a pretty strong, obviously, government presence in China, and so that means a very big emphasis on censoring films in China. So there are only certain things that you can say. There are a lot of things you can't say, particularly in regards to the Chinese government. And so if the U.S. wants to get their films over there, they have to kind of abide by some of those censorship ideas. And that's something that pretty starkly contradicts the idea of free speech in the United States, and something that film has long been a benefactor of. And so a lot of that censorship is not nearly as blatant or apparent, but it's something that you should definitely be aware of when watching these films. So one of those examples would be in the most recent Top Gun sequel. The Japanese flag was removed from Tom Cruise's iconic jacket because they wanted to appeal to China. There's also a lot of big push for some big Chinese actors to be in big budget films in the United States. So it's definitely something that I've noticed a lot more. People that you might not know over in the States, but have a very big presence in China. And representation and a global presence as far as actors go, I think, is really important, but it is pretty apparent that it is something that the U.S. market is trying to do to get more box office from China. So that's something to be aware of. A lot of times there will also be different cuts of films for the Chinese market versus the rest of the world. So Iron Man 3 had a 3-minute scene, two extra scenes that involved Chinese doctors operating on him. Certain scenes were cut out of other films to make it more economically and politically viable for China. And so that's something that I think is really important to talk about, the relationship between different countries as far as film goes. And so China is the largest growing market, the fastest growing market, and the U.S. wants to cater to that and wants to create things. And so that's something that I wanted to talk about today, given that the film industry is something that I'm very fascinated on, and understanding the context of the movies that we're watching, I think is really important to understand, to having a holistic view of film. And so I might be doing some updates on this in the future, particularly around COVID. Obviously, again, this was a very global, foreign-themed episode, and I'm definitely not the best person to be talking about a lot of these things. I grew up in the United States. I've never lived anywhere else, and so I'm only coming at this from a research perspective. So I would urge, if you're interested, to get a lot of other different perspectives on this issue, or just on information around the film industry at large, because I think it's super fascinating. So if you liked this segment, please let me know over at GSMC_movies on Twitter. I'm checking that. Shub's checking that. Elizabeth is checking that. And we'd love to talk to you, love to respond to you guys. And so if you have any thoughts on that segment or any other segment, please let me know. But that's the episode. I really like talking about films that are not from the United States, because the United States is such a dominant force. I love getting some other films, some other perspectives, and a lot of times some of the best films are coming out of, I would say most of the time, a lot of my favorite films are coming out of other countries. So I would urge that if you're not somebody who watches foreign films, to check those out every now and then. Find some of the best ones, because a lot of them can be streaming. And so this week, I talked about The Platform, Parasite, and On a Magical Night. I also ran down some of the biggest film industries in the world and what that means for the context of film. So that's today's episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. I enjoyed talking about it. And as always, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review, because that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.